I'm Elisa Bielatich Davis, and this is Everyday Orthodox. We get together on Sunday nights to meet a new Everyday Orthodox Christian, and now we're getting together on video and audio. But we get together here to meet Everyday Orthodox Christians because I feel like real Orthodox unity is like a grassroots movement, right? It doesn't have to be administrative unity. It can just be getting to know one another as brothers and sisters in Christ and understanding each other. And so tonight we are going to meet a wonderful guest, and I think you're going to very much enjoy it. So without any further ado, let me tell you who's on the show tonight. His name is Father Thomas Manuel, and he is he's a recent priest. He just sort of lately became a priest, actually, but he's a 2014 graduate of Holy Cross, and he's currently at Holy Apostles Greek Orthodox Church in Loudoun County, Virginia. But actually, until just recently, he was in Guatemala. He and his presbytera, Elizabeth, began 4 years of service in Guatemala and southern Mexico as missionaries with the Orthodox Christian Mission Center, which is OCMC. And so many of you are familiar with OCMC. If you're not, go to ocmc.org and check it out. You can even adopt a missionary and help. But so Father Thomas and his wife Elizabeth were down in southern Mexico and Guatemala. Father Thomas was actually teaching at the seminary down there at San Andres, while Presbytera Elizabeth was directing music ministry, training local choirs and seminarians. And so I'm sure we'll hear all about just the wonderful things that are happening with Orthodoxy in Guatemala. And if you don't already know about it, you're in for a treat because it really is very interesting. And so just lately, in 2020, Father Thomas became a deacon. And in 2021, he was ordained to the priesthood by Archbishop Elpidoforos. So he is, just a couple years into his priesthood. So without any further ado, Father Thomas, welcome to the program.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you for having me tonight. This is really fun, really cool. First time on Ancient Faith Radio. Hi, everybody.
Right? It's so fun and also on
Yeah,
video. Now we're
on
just getting
video.
started
Yeah,
with video, so this is a very exciting
yeah.
development.
I'll
Of
have to
course, it means
behave
everybody
myself
has
over
to.
here.
That's just means everybody has to call in very early to do a lot of technical work nowadays, but I
Sure.
think it's worth it. It's been very cool. But so,
Yeah.
Father, welcome. So you are no longer in the missions. Are you going to be going back and doing more mission work, you think?
Well, yeah.
It's hard to
Prophetic
say, huh?
work is probably the worst business to get into. I can never really speak to the future like that. We very much have a heart and a love for missions. And there was a man we were working with, Father John Chacos, who was our supervisor, who kind of, in many ways, did the same thing that we did in that he and his wife, actually, they went to Brazil when they were just married. Imagine, just married, they go to Brazil for 2 years, Peace Corps in the 60s. They do
Wow.
2 years and then they come back. Then he retires from full-time mission work at a parish and becomes a full-time missionary in Guatemala for the last 12 years. So I have no idea what the Lord will have in store for me for the future. It is very much open in both of our hearts, but currently we are not active in Guatemala at the moment. Though if they invite us down for any event, we are more than happy to fly down.
Yeah. Hint, hint. Anyone in Guatemala listening? Father
Yeah, si
Thomas,
alguien está
happy to
escuchando.
come.
Yeah,
That's awesome. So,
yeah,
where does your story start? Like, I mean, where were you born? How did you grow up?
sure. Well, I'm the son of a priest. Surprise, surprise. When it rains, it pours. And missions had always been a major aspect. Outreach and being very active with your faith had always been something that wasn't taught to us by instruction, but by example. And my father really grew up in a parish that was very active, Annunciation Lancaster, under Father Alex Veronis, who was one of actually the starting founders of OCMC. And so this idea of being an outreach individual, of being a church with a light on the hill to go and spread that message to all other nations, was something that was kind of instilled in the whole family from an early age. And so growing up, we were in that environment. I watched my father get ordained. We were in Richmond for a few years. and we just got very active in the life of the church. I mean, we were always just kind of finding that next step of service. In college, we did real break trips with OCF. I went to Guatemala in 2007 at the Hogar Rafael, which is near the capital, which is an orphanage slash monastery. And then
Mhm.
from there, it kind of just captured our love and desire to serve the Lord. And it kind of propelled us into service generally. Uh, but then, um, after I graduated seminary, single, uh, and not, not sure what to do, I found a youth director position in Norfolk, Virginia, and that's where I met my wife, who also happened to want to go to Guatemala, uh,
Oh,
by
very
happenstance.
convenient.
Yes. So,
Well, wait,
she
tell me
met,
the story. How did you meet her? How, like, what was I always love
so,
hearing that
yeah.
story.
So, okay. The church has the setup. There's the choir on the one side of the solea and the chanters on the other side. So you can imagine kind of like an old Greek man and a couple other people. And for Holy Week, they kind of hired me for the week to stare at me to make sure that they wanted to hire me full time for the fall. So that was awkward enough, right? And I'm there with the chanters. I'm helping out. I was kind of like the English chanter for the week. And I see the choir come out. And they come out in their blue frocks and they have the organ there all set up, and they're all boomers, we would say, generation wise. They're all, a bit older, minus this one really beautiful young lady in her probably mid early 20s. I don't know. So, a friend of ours kind of connects us. Actually, that friend is getting married next weekend, so kind of full circle of life. And I'll be doing the wedding. She kind of connects us, and we say hello, we greet, giggle. I get the job, and that later that summer, and by that fall, we're dating. Uh, she started showing up to Bible study. I started showing up to Bible study. I love our priest, but it wasn't for Bible study necessarily. We were just trying to find excuses to kind of be around each other without being obvious. Um, and we started dating. And very early in the relationship, we went on a walk with my dog Pungo, who has since passed. But Pungo we were on a walk with him, and she looked to me and she said, I want to be a missionary. I want to go to Guatemala. Very serious conversation, probably a few months into the relationship, right? And she said, look, I'm gonna go. You can come with me, or I'm gonna go by myself. And you know I mean, she was just so cute, she was just so beautiful. So we joke because we ended up going to Guatemala. I mean, we got married in January of 2017, and we were on the boots on the ground in southern Mexico and Guatemala 2 years later in January 2019. And it just The Lord works in mysterious ways, I mean, in all aspects.
That's lovely. That's really neat. That is really
Yeah.
neat. As a kid, did you kind of I mean, you're growing up there in Lancaster and moving in churches with your dad. You always kind of were just on this path then. Like, it wasn't like you're not one of those people who goes, "I never thought I'd be a priest. I never thought I'd be a missionary." You were just were is that right? When you were young, did you sort of feel like that was your direction?
It was kind of just it was always just one smooth transition from one thing to the next. So, I mean, to give an example, it's very common in the Greek Orthodox Church to be an altar boy until you graduate high school. But then
Mhm.
after high school, I didn't want to go to the pews. I wanted to keep serving. So I went to the chant stand. And then I started doing youth work, and then I started getting involved with my OCF. And then I was like, "Oh, let me go to this seminary and see what it's like. Oh, this is fun." It was just kind of this progression of answering all these little callings from the Lord. But it always felt right. It always felt natural. My home has always been the church. And so being a priest, serving in Guatemala, all of these different things have just kind of been a natural progression from just this innate desire to respond to the Lord's calling to serve Him with all of our heart, mind, and strength. That's what He calls from us. I mean, today's gospel was all about the calling of the fishermen. We're all called to kind of have that response. Christianity is an active faith of sacrifice, and sometimes we have to pony up. We have to not just, it's not just our words, it's our actions. And so Guatemala specifically, mission field specifically, because we wanted to we wanted to give as much, we wanted to give back as much as we could in an area that really needed help, that really had a need for support, and so that's kind of one of the impetuses why we went to Guatemala,
Well,
of
tell me
many.
a little bit about what was going on with Guatemala, because my understanding is that, um, and I might be wrong about this, but is it not that weren't there just a ton of conversions in Guatemala all at the like all kind of all at once, and there was like a
Sure,
scramble a bit to have enough priests to cover, and
sure,
tell me, what went on and why were there conversions, all of
sure.
it?
Sure. So to understand what happened in Guatemala with the Orthodox Church, you have to really understand that Guatemala went through a 30-year civil war, starting in the 60s, ending in 1996. And that really was an extension of the Cold War, where the United States was kind of intervening in different parts of the country, of the world. Vietnam, Guatemala, they tried in Cuba, it didn't work out too well. Eastern Europe, Greece, Turkey, all sorts of areas to kind of stem the tide of communism. And so there were um, groups in Guatemala that seemed to have communist tendencies, and a civil war broke out. To kind of give long story short, it turned into kind of a semi-genocidal war in which the government began to fight with indigenous tribes who were trying to protect their land, and they misinterpreted that sort of as communism, but it was really more of, no, this is our indigenous land. And so when the war ended, there was a very large population of displaced indigenous people throughout the area, and not only displaced geographically, but sort of religiously too. And so a large group of them who had a leader named Father Andres Giron, who was kind of the founder and the man who brought all of these people into the Orthodox Church. He was an educated man. He was from the capital. He was in the government. He was a senator. He was a Ladino, which is code word for he was of European stock and background, but he decided to kind of cast his lot in with the indigenous populations, along, not on a political side, but on a, we need to, this is the image of Christ. These people deserve the gospel. They deserve all of the benefits of humanity. And so he gave a life of service to them, and he would fight for the rights for their land, for their villages, and he had a very large following. And so he himself was in all of this movement, and he discovered the Orthodox Church actually when, in all places, he was in Rome. He discovered the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, and he began to explore the Orthodox Church and was very intrigued with the Orthodox Church. And at that time, there was tension because the Roman Catholic Church in Guatemala, I know there's a lot here. I'm trying to give the brief version.
No,
There was
no, it's
a lot of,
interesting. I appreciate it.
yeah, there was a lot of relationship with the Catholic hierarchy and the Guatemalan government. And so there was a lot of tension
Right.
with indigenous groups further out into the country. And so basically, long story short, when Father Andres left the Catholic Church, he was never defrocked, but it was kind of just released and never given another assignment. He was kind of what we would call like an archimandrite, so he wasn't a bishop necessarily, but he was on the list of a monsignor, a man that could have been elevated to the episcopacy. But everybody looked at him as kind of their bishop because he was the man who literally supervised them. A bishop is a episkopos, he who looks over the flock. And so when he left into the Orthodox Church, everybody followed with him en masse. All of these groups of indigenous that he had been working with for decades, with their land and with acquiring their land and protecting their rights and all of these various things. So it wasn't like he had to go out and start a little mission church. It was this mass movement of people who were already with him, kind of from a political, socio-political standard, that flowed into the Orthodox Church all at once. And so in 2010 was when they were officially brought into the canonical Orthodox Church because they actually stumbled into a non-canonical church at first, which was a little unfortunate. Uh, but
It
they were
happens
finally
to a lot of
received.
people. But, I mean, it's kind of our fault, right? Because it's not there's a way in which we're not quite clear enough to identify that we're really Orthodox, so then there are all these other people who just write Orthodox on their website, and you think that they're Orthodox too, and I
Sure,
it's awful. It's
anybody
terrifying.
could go out and buy vestments and dress like a bishop and then put on the true Orthodox Church of etc. and then
Yep.
just start accepting people. And that's, people don't realize that. And they went on, they just they encountered some bishop and they became non-canonical for amount of time. Um, but they finally were received in 2010 by Archbishop Athenagoras of the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Mexico, so under the Patriarchate of Constantinople, Bartholomew,
Okay.
and that was in 2010 when they were received into the canonical Orthodox Church.
Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of the long story compressed into a few minutes because there's twists, there's turns, and to be honest, I had to ask 1,000 questions just to get all that information because I wasn't there
Right.
for all of that period
Right.
myself.
Well, it's sort of fascinating, and because Bishop Athenagoras came to our parish at one point, and in Texas, he ordained a priest who was going down to Guatemala with him to serve. And
Hmm.
it was like 2011 or 12. And they were talking
Mhm.
about this, and it was, I don't remember the exact statistic, but it was like 7,000 people and three priests or something,
Sure,
crazy because it all happened so suddenly and so quickly. So
sure.
has that recovered now? Like, have they caught up to where now the church has kind of the means of serving everybody
Sure,
appropriately?
sure. So, okay, well, when they were first brought in, you could read some articles. Some said, "Oh, 100,000 people in Guatemala are Orthodox," or, we've
Yeah.
done calculations, and it's hard to do these numbers because, it's hard to do census numbers in the U.S. Imagine the highlands of Guatemala. It's
Right.
probably somewhere between 10 to 15,000 faithful, which is still
Okay.
a massive number.
Yeah.
It's about 100 communities in Guatemala and 25 communities in southern Chiapas. So you have to
Okay.
remember the Civil War, a lot of people were fleeing the country to escape the persecution from the government. So all of the communities in Mexico are Guatemalan by origin. They're Guatemalan second generation, third generation. Now they're
Okay.
Mexican now, but they had that connection, that genesis from Guatemala. And so it's kind of almost like a pouring over of people that fell into that part of Mexico. So there's 100 in Guatemala, about 25 in Mexico. So 125 communities and about six clergy. So
Oh, wow. How do they
yeah.
do that? Are they just rotating all the time?
Well, yeah, that's kind of the problem is you have too much too many churches all over the place with not enough clergy to be on hand regularly. So yeah, they do their best to kind of divvy up their vicariate, their diocese. It's not actually it's a vicariate, so it's kind of like it's just under a vicar. It's not under its own bishop, but they
Okay.
break it up into different sections geographically based on which priest lives in which area. And some priests have a bigger responsibility. The vicar obviously is the one that is overarching all things, and he's the one in charge of the seminarians directly. And so he's visiting most of the communities and doing most of the groundwork. But the other clergy, one of the priests is in his late 60s, I believe, and he's covering about, I want to say, 18 to 20 communities. Um,
Wow.
and so it's just a matter of traveling around and visiting another community on another day, whether that's a Sunday or a Tuesday or you name it. So it's a lot of movement. It's a small country about the size of Ohio with the mountains of Colorado. Um,
Okay. So kind of West
yeah,
Virginia-ish, right? Like you want to get from one town to the next, but it could take hours because you got to get down the
sure,
mountain and then back up the other one. Yeah.
sure.
That's
Yeah,
interesting. So,
yeah,
well, I was just going to say the seminary there. So you taught at the seminary, right? Is
sure.
it San
Yeah,
Andres? Is that
The,
in
so the
honor of?
seminaries, yeah. So seminary is, yeah. So, Andrew is kind of San Andres for the patron. He's kind of, well, he's a big deal for them, and they almost looked at him. They look at him as kind of their bishop, their patron, their patron, their the man who kind of brought them into the church. If you think about how different countries look at different saints as kind of their patron saint of their nation, it would almost be that sort of aspect of how they honor him, having even like an image of him in their church is not, kind of like if we put up a picture of the current bishop,
Mhm.
they still have
Yeah,
pictures of him, even though he
right.
he fell asleep in the Lord a few years ago. In 2014, he passed away. So
Do you
you're
think do you think he'll be a saint someday? I mean, I would imagine that locally there he'll be celebrated as a saint at some point, probably, right?
yeah,
I mean,
that I
he's
mean,
like Saint Nina,
uh,
right? I mean, that's
Right. It could very well happen. He's already kind of honored in that way. The seminary is named after him. You go to a random church in the mountains, and there's a big image of him off to the side. So the seminary is called San Andres, and it has a core of incredible seminarians. That, I mean, being with these guys makes all of our seminaries in the U.S. look pathetic in that, not that the education is masterful, but these guys do everything. They're students, they're doing parish visits with the bishop or the vicar. Um, they are woodworkers. They've learned how to do uh, icon screens by looking at videos and watching and taking and looking at photos off Google. They've learned iconography by just exploring iconography. Um, Necessity just breeds that creativity, and they are just these incredibly, and they're young men. Um, we were there when we first got there. There was about 13 or 12 seminarians, and when we left, we were I was blessed enough to see the two oldest get ordained into the diaconate. Padre Andres, named after, or Diacono Padre Andres, in honor of the Father Andres, the man who began the mission, and then the second one is his name is Deacon Elias, in honor of Bishop Elias, who passed away here in the United States of the GOA.
wow. Oh, that's really neat. It is interesting because, as you mentioned, right, when you look at the history of Orthodox nations and of Orthodox peoples, there is always like the enlightener. There's the person who brought them to the church. And in Eastern Europe, you look at the history of it, and there is often a movement from Catholic to Orthodox and back, and back and forth, and eventually stabilizing with one or the other. But so, in a sense, this is like something that was happening in the 800s and 900s happening now,
Sure,
and very similar because it's like ethnic, it's cultural, it's political, it's all of those things, and it's also religious, all tied up
sure.
together, and then they develop this Orthodox identity. Wow,
Right,
that's
because I mean
really
those things they're all connected. I know people complain about the relationship between Constantine and religion and the state and all these things and the empire, but really, and in these traditional societies, which all of the world was before the French Revolution, really, I mean,
mm,
everything was interconnected. You couldn't separate out your country's political, socio cultural issues with what was going on with the faith. And people mixed in all different aspects. And it wasn't necessarily, we kind of poo-poo it now because of our American idea of separation of church and state, which kind of comes from a bunch of guys who didn't believe in Christianity to begin with. So I don't understand, Thomas Jefferson he didn't really care about Christ and the gospel. I mean, so why are we listening to his philosophy on religion? Anyway,
right.
another
You
conversation
know
for
what?
another day.
Don't even get me started on that. He had a private Bible that he would read, and he went through and he took out all the miracles because he thought that they
Right.
were nonsense. It's like, okay,
Right. And yeah, we're
if you're
obsessed with this idea of separation of church and state. But like anyway, so yeah, it
no,
was this
no,
great interconnectedness. Yeah. And our
mm,
main work was with the seminary. We were brought down to help with the seminary education. Myself, primarily because I had a theological background, but also my wife, Presbyter Elizabeth, then just hermana, sister Elizabeth. Uh,
Oh, neat.
so yeah,
That's neat. And so and of course, the seminarians, they're all local, right? They're all indigenous. They're people from Guatemala who will be educated,
sure,
go through the seminary, and become clergy in
sure,
Guatemala so that they'll be served by their own clergy instead of always by
sure.
imports, you know?
Right.
That's great.
So let's
That's
add a few
beautiful.
more layers of confusion. In Guatemala, there's over 20 indigenous languages on top of Spanish. So
No
Spanish would be
way.
the lingua franca. Yeah. Spanish is the common
What?
language that you use outside the village, but inside the country, there's Chuk, there's Popti, there's Cajoval, there's all these different languages. And in the mission proper, we had about 7 different language groups represented, and it was kind of fortuitous. If you took a survey of the seminarians, all but I believe 2 spoke Spanish from birth. The rest of them were an indigenous language first and Spanish second. So it was nice coming in as a gringo, as a white guy, and having my struggling with Spanish and knowing that at least I was speaking to guys whose grammar wasn't impeccable either. Because they were also, in many respects, they far more advanced than I was. But
Right.
so yeah, we had a couple from one group over here and a couple from another language group over there. And obviously all the classes were in Spanish. Please don't ask me to speak any indigenous language. You will hear nothing, because it was very difficult, incredibly difficult. I could make people smile by trying to pronounce something. That was about it.
That's it. It's like the joke, right? Like when I go to Denmark and see my family, there's a lot of that. Like, okay, hey, American, can you try to say this? And then everybody chuckles as we
Uh-huh.
struggle to make that sound. Yeah, I know the feeling. But
Yeah.
all right, we are going to take just a super short break, a little ancient faith announcement time, and we will be right back with Father Thomas.
Ancient Faith Publishing is pleased to announce a new release that is part history, part theology, and part devotional. The Story of Jesus, A History and Theology of Christ, explores the complete life and teachings of our Lord, from before his conception in Mary's womb until his ascension. Revered 20th century Egyptian elder and scholar Matthew the Poor wrote many volumes on the subject of Christ's significance, life, and teachings, which translator James Helmy has distilled into one highly readable book that will make a valuable addition to every Christian's library. The Story of Jesus is now available in paperback and ebook at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We are here tonight with Father Thomas Manuel, and we have been talking about Guatemala, actually, about all of the conversions that happened there and why, and sort of the complexity of it. And of course, we're talking to Father Thomas about it because he spent 4 years with OCMC there in Guatemala, and he was at the seminary. And we were just talking about the seminary. So, Father, I have a question. You mentioned that there are a lot of indigenous languages plus Spanish as the lingua franca, the main language there. I assume most of the Orthodox services and everything have been translated into Spanish, but probably
Mhm.
not into the local languages, right?
Sure. It's not that nobody wants to necessarily, but you really need to start with your first priorities. And the
Mhm.
first thing that we wanted to do is really make sure that people were familiar with just even the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, and really learned how to we not me along with myself and the other missionaries, Father John Chacos, Jesse Brando, Jennifer Rice, etc., worked on having a nice broken down simple divine liturgy, but it had to be in Spanish because again, it would have taken 7 to 10 years to really specialize in just one dialect, and I could be in village A doing this dialect, and then I would cross over to the other village, and it could be a completely different we use the word dialect, but it's a different language a lot of times. And so the strategy of the mission was let's get things stable in Spanish before we kind of break off into
Mm.
any other language, which could get complicated uh, depending on who you're speaking to, in that the men would know Spanish more often than the women. because it was the men that would leave the village more often to work, and the women would stay behind, especially if you're an older woman. So there was times where I would walk into a community, and I realized after 5, 10 minutes that even my broken Spanish as a gringo was more advanced than even the men in the community, because it was such an isolated community. And I would have to simplify my sermon down to, you know, 4 minutes just to keep it, keep it very basic, because, I could sit there and talk for 25 minutes, but, like St. Paul says, if you don't speak in the language of the people, you're just just a cymbal clanging away, and it just doesn't help with anything. So everything is done in Spanish right now. The exception maybe like with the Agape Vespers on Pascha, we would do different languages to kind of, show the universality of the gospel message.
That's beautiful. Well, I'm sure in time, right? But you're still at a point where you have, priests trying to cover 20 parishes. So it's sort of priorities, right? You have to prioritize, I think, when
Sure,
you're
yes.
setting that up.
Lots of
But
priorities, yes.
but how beautiful to have so many native speakers coming up as priests, because it'll be their generation that'll be able to do a lot of that translation and all of that stuff. So that's really
Sure,
neat. How beautiful. So tell
sure.
me, Father, okay, so when you met Elizabeth, she's warning you that she wants to be a missionary, and you're sort of smiling like, hey, no problem, me too. Um, what steps do you go through in order to be a mission? Like, say if someone listening is like, 23 years old and going, "Yeah, I want to be a missionary." Like, what do you do? Or 50 years
Sure.
old, frankly. Like,
Great question. And you know what? That's what OCMC is here for, essentially. They are the sending agency, because you can buy a ticket and fly down to Guatemala, and you can sit in divine liturgy and just kind of hang out. And there are people that would kind of do that. But if you want to go and serve for long term, you really need to go through OCMC. So the first step would simply be to contact them. And that's what my wife had already been in contact with OCMC for about, I think, about a year before we even met. Um, and so when, we got serious, and we, uh, said we were going to get married, OCMC said, stay married for a year and then reapply. So what you do is there's like an inquiry period, and then there's a candidacy period of kind of where they review you. You go down to OCMC, you talk about options, what are your talents that you can offer, what's your language background, all sorts of different little details, because you can't just drop somebody off into, Zimbabwe without them being able to speak the local language or understand what they're getting into. So OCMC does all that prep work for you, on that kind of spiritual and practical side. And then on top of that, we live in a world where we have to use money to get around. We need money to kind of operate. And so OCMC helps you to fundraise and to go around the U.S. kind of explaining and promoting and creating a donor base of people who want to kind of team up with you, because it's not just Father Thomas or President Elizabeth or Father Juvenal or the Ritzies who go down. It's the entire Church of the United States, cross jurisdiction, and that's the beauty of OCMC, is that they operate cross jurisdictionally, and so that you would go. And so we got married in 2017. We started fundraising a year later in 2018, and we did about 10 months of fundraising while I was still working full time as a youth director, and my wife was working full time as a special ed teacher. So it was a busy first year and a half of marriage. All of our years of marriage have been very busy, actually, now that I say that.
right? Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Why the policy to wait a year? Is it just because it would be putting so much pressure on a brand new marriage to try to be in a strange country and doing all of that,
Sure.
or what is the logic of it?
Yeah. I mean, there was no specific policy necessarily. I think we were an
Mhm.
exception, that we were get so newly married and also like, let's go. But it was, let's make sure you guys get to know each other first. Now, this could be wrong, but I've heard that in Orthodox Jewish circles that a newly married couple is really, in some point in time, they were forbidden from doing any work the first year of marriage and just kind of getting
Oh,
together.
wow.
I've heard that a few times, So maybe something
Yeah.
along those lines. But it was really just to make
Yeah.
sure that we had a solid foundation of a marriage. And I understand 1 year of marriage is not necessarily like a
Right.
massive amount of time, but it's better than just 3 months. You know, she
Right.
and I get to know each other a bit more.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Well, and it is. It's a little bit more time to get to know each other and to sort of build a more stable structure there. And it's already a big change to get married. So it's like, all right, let's take them changes one at a time. But I think it's
sure.
so interesting that part of being a missionary is being able to go around and raise money because it almost feels like those are different skill sets or those are different callings or something. But would you say that the skill set that you need to raise money in the States also comes in handy in the work as a missionary, or is it really like 2 different parts of the job that are kind of unrelated?
No, they're definitely related because a missionary, is somebody that's going to have to work dealing with all sorts of different people in all different situations. And so it's almost kind of like a good preamble or a test of your desire to go and your ability to organize, because OCMC helps you organize it, but you're almost kind of like an independent contractor in that they're not planning your visits for you. They're not saying go to this parish on this Sunday. They're kind of giving you a broad map. They're telling you how to fundraise. They're giving you the OCMC cards if you've ever walked into a parish and seen the cards with the picture and everything. They tell you to do the envelopes, how to do asks, but then it's kind of up to you, and that's good because it puts the responsibility on you, and it's really up to the missionary in that respect. Now, it's also a disadvantage because different people have speaking abilities. Sometimes people aren't as connectable as others, and so some missionaries sometimes do struggle. So, wink, wink, all parishes of the United States, if you're ever receiving a missionary or you want to receive one, you know, be generous with them because some people it is hard to public speak in different communities,
Mhm.
and it can be stressful to step into a church that you've never met anybody before. It could be a different jurisdiction, different language. The priest could be pro missionary or he could be apathetic to missions, depending, and you can kind of feel that pretty quick. And sometimes you get invited by a parishioner, not the priest, and the priest kind of wants you there and he's happy to have you. A lot of priests think that if they invite a missionary that they're taking money away from their parish. And so that's kind of an issue of,
Um,
oh, well, if this parishioner gives this priest and becomes a donor of this priest, then that money
mhm.
is not coming towards uh, X. And
The
that's
building
kind of
campaign
anyway,
or
but
something.
that's
But, you
going
know,
down a
that I
different
think though
topic.
that I've always appreciated the fact that our bishop here, our metropolitan, has always talked about how he's always telling his priests and his parishes, fundraise for everything, because the more you
Mhm.
build a culture of giving, the more generous your people are going to be. And if you want your
Sure,
church budget to be higher, bring in the OCMC, bring in IOCC and Focus and everybody else,
sure.
because the more we think of ourselves as people who give, the more we're going to give. So
Right.
hopefully,
It's a
hopefully that
lifestyle of
kind of
giving.
message gets out.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It is,
And
if
it's
you think
across
of
the
yourself
board. If
that
you
way.
give so much to OCMC, you'll also get in the practice of giving to your church or giving to IOCC. So I agree as well. But
Mhm.
sometimes, unfortunately, we don't teach uh, fundraising or finance or parish finance well to all of our clergy. And a lot of clergy are under stress
Mhm.
too. I mean, they're dealing with not balanced budgets, or maybe they're a bivocational priest and
Yeah.
they have to work on the side. And so it's understandable. And as the missioner, you have to be respectful to the priest. But we loved it. It was a lot of fun. We went from all the way up in kind of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in the north down to Atlanta, Georgia in the south.
Mhm.
And so we saw a lot of parishes, probably about 50 communities total. We would kind of, some weekends she would go, some weekends I would go, some weekends we'd go together. It's just depending on the schedule. But it was a lot of fun. I'm a yapper, that's why I'm a priest. Um, so it was great to kind of get there, meet, greet people, shake hands, kiss babies, all that kind of stuff. It was a lot of fun. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's neat. Did your connections, being a priest's son, help? Because I would imagine
Oh
if your
yeah.
dad knows
Oh.
all the priests, right? So you know all the priests, so you've been to all the
Well,
clergy
it's
laities.
him. Yeah, it's him and Holy Cross. I basically called up all my classmates, and having worked in the church, it was it was easier for me than I feel bad because sometimes people come through that program and they're asked to fundraise, but they don't have that interconnectedness that the Orthodox Church really does have. We're one big happy family, even though we squabble and fight all the time. But because I had been active in the life of the church in so many different ways, you're now Bishop Morales. I called him up on his cell phone and said, "Hey, at the time, Father Dean, can I come to Baltimore?" Of course, and we went up. We spent the night. He took us out for sheet crab soup and for crabs because it was Baltimore, Maryland. The next day, I had it just the red carpet, because he's just that kind of guy, and we had that kind of connection, and I felt comfortable to make that phone call because priests want missionaries to reach out like that too. A lot of them want opportunities to show their people that the Orthodox Church is out there, is reaching out to the needy, and is seeking those who are seeking the church. It's important for people to know that because here in America, we lived in a very privileged society, whether you're West Virginia, Oregon, Loudoun County, Virginia, the amount of wealth and the privilege of where we live blinds us many times to how much of the rest of the world is living. And the more that we can give back, the better. Because I mean, it's also just the gospel. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be as well. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So tell me, as you mentioned, right, things in the United States, even in places that we think of as maybe being, less well off, generally speaking, the quality of life or the lifestyle or whatever is considerably higher than a lot of places in rural Guatemala, right? So,
sure.
what was that like for you guys when you first went to Guatemala? You'd already been as a kid, so you'd been to the Hogar, so you had seen
hmm
Guatemala a
But even
bit,
the Hogars and the capital. So that was a different experience because the capital is, it's like New York City compared to Huntington, West Virginia, kind of a difference
right?
would be a good
Yeah.
example. Um, so where we were at was the state of Huehuetenango. So if you are a coffee aficionado, Huehuetenango, it's a
Yeah.
coffee from, it might even have come from an Orthodox plantation. Plantation is not a bad word, it just means a plant farm, right? Um, so most of the people were from that part. Huehuetenango is the poorest department or one of the poorest states, the municipalities in the country of Guatemala. There is more immigration from this department than the rest of Guatemala combined to the United States. That's how much economic difference there is. Because Guatemala is a very wealthy country, but there's an incredible amount of disparity of wealth. There's also the issue of the colonial, more European background people versus the indigenous side. There's access and connection to the capital. So where we were at was really, we would go into Guatemala, land in a nice city with a nice airport, and then we would go out into the boonies, essentially. But Guatemalan style. So to give a few quick examples, I mean, the village we lived in, there was no paved road. It was a dirt road that was kind of maintained by the community. Sometimes there was power, sometimes there was not power. Sometimes you would go without power for a day, sometimes a week, sometimes a month. You never know. Most of the people were farmers, so subsistence farming. And when you would go to visit a community and they would give you the traditional bowl of chicken soup, because chicken soup is big in Mexico and Guatemala. We think tacos, burritos, enchiladas. Yeah, okay, sometimes, right? But for your normal run-of-the-mill uh, uh, farmer, a bowl of chicken soup, but that chicken that they just gave you was a chicken that they just killed from their farm. And so it was a literal
Mm.
sacrifice that they were giving. They weren't going to the supermarket and turning around and buying
Mm.
chicken and bringing it in. And so it was hard, that the disparity of the wealth was noticeable and it was difficult. It was a hard barrier at times because people knew that even us as missionaries who were giving up so much and we had so little compared to our compatriots in the United States, compared to the average Guatemalan that we were serving, we had 50 times the resources that they did. It was just the disparity is massive.
Wow. Well, and I
Hmm.
imagine that's part of what leads to all of the social upheaval as well and all of the stuff that had
Hmm.
gone on. But
Sure.
so, how is the seminary in terms of funding and
Mhm.
all of that? Like, does the seminary struggle a lot there, or is it going gangbusters? What's the situation?
So yeah, it's kind of almost like a more traditional understanding of what a seminary is in the Orthodox Church, and what I mean by that is in the 21st century, in the 20th century, you go to a school and sit down classes, and you have a formal degree that's issued by an accredited school. And that's a very new thing in the Orthodox world. The older practice was you would just mirror the priest in your village, and you would learn to do the liturgy and the chants, and you would serve in different capacities. And when the bishop deemed you worthy, he would, make you axios. He would make you worthy, right? I mean, like you would get ordained. And so the seminary is kind of like a hybrid between those two styles. The students don't pay for anything. I mean, there's no tuition. They can't afford their farmers' boys. I mean, there's what they're not going to pay in anything. So there's no tuition, but they're working all the time. They're going on trips with the vicar. They're the altar boys and the deacons and the chanters and the teachers, and they're the ones putting the calendars together, the liturgical calendars, and leading the retreats for the catechists, the lay leaders, and all the communities. So it's a complete package seminary. But that being said, yes, there is economic need even for the seminary. I mean, when we were leaving, they were completing the new construction on the new building so that they could have a place for not only the seminarians. So it's the seminarians are kind of those who have dedicated their whole time, but to kind of bridge that gap in the villages where the priest only reaches every so often, think of like super parish council members who are both parish council members, but when the priest isn't there, also reads the daily readings for that week and gives a sermon and
Yeah.
leads the worship service, not Eucharist, but prayer. And
Mhm.
those men and women need to be trained too. And so that seminary is also a center for their education too, because before that
Excellent.
building has been put up, people were coming from 6, 7, 8 hours away and sleeping
Oh,
on a dirt floor outside and being there for 2, 3 days so that they could learn about the Orthodox faith. And they would do that quarterly, 4 times a year. Um, and so the seminary has multi purposes. One, and we're talking about 150 men and women in Guatemala and probably about another 60 in Mexico that are a part of
yeah.
that lay leader catechist class. So it's kind of there's a tier. There's kind of the high the priests, the seminarians, and then kind of the lay leaders. And the church is kind of building all of those up at the same time, hoping that many of the lay leaders jump up into the seminarians, and the seminarians get ordained to the clergy as well. So there is a strategy, and there is definitely financial assistance. And again, connect with OCMC. Just ask. Just send an email. Hey, we want to help support the seminary in Guatemala. How can we do that? Because it's hundreds of thousands of dollars to get these buildings constructed, and most of that money, I mean, the people are farmers. They can only give, but they give their labor. So how it works, sorry, I'm kind of just going off, but
No, it's
so how
good.
it works is all of the seminaries built by different communities. So the vicar and the seminarians coordinate and have this corner of the mission bring in a team for this week, and then next week these two communities, and then the week after these two communities. So it's literally the people doing the building, laying the cement, all the work that for us
Mm.
looks exhausting, and we would all tire out in an hour. These guys are out there in the hot sun doing that, but the financial backing comes primarily from OCMC, to be perfectly frank. And that's the beauty of OCMC, is that they can funnel those funds into a canonically blessed mission and really concentrate that effort into the most needful things first.
Oh, that's really neat. That's really, and it's
Hmm.
also, I mean, that keeps expenses down, that they're doing all of the work. And it makes me think of my time in a mission parish in the US, right? Like not missionary, but in a building a new
Hmm.
parish. Everybody has to learn how to do stuff, right? Like you have to learn how to chant, or we need a Sunday school teacher, or somebody's going to have to build an iconostas, or whatever it is. And it's like nationwide situation just like that there, right? Where
Sure.
everybody's pitching in and everybody's learning how to fulfill multiple roles, and that's really neat. That's very, very neat.
Yeah.
So what made you guys come home? What happened?
Uh, well, a number of little factors. I mean, two little factors. Names are Vasily and Thanasi, my two boys.
Ah,
And well, I mean, so we went down as a single married couple, I like to call us. So, in that, we were married, but, we didn't have children. And then after, we had Vasily in 2020 and then Thanasi in 2022. And um, it just, for us personally, it was just getting hard to do the balance because I was also ordained in 2021. And so I was being sent on parish visits, which again, I could handle. We would, wake up at 4 a.m., 2, 3 hour ride, go to community, divine liturgy, 30 baptisms, 7 weddings, come back home, repeat the next day,
oh, wow.
repeat the next day. But as a family unit, that was getting to be a bit more complicated. And
Mhm.
so OCMC operates in 2 year terms. So you kind of go for 2 years of service at a time. And so we were closing out our second term and we were praying about it and we were really struggling with it because it was not an easy decision for us because the need there is again 50 times more than what any parish priest here is talking about, where on a
Mhm.
regular Sunday you have a priest. That's a blessing. You should walk into your church on a Sunday morning and do your cross and say, glory to God, I have a priest this Sunday, because that's not the case around the world. And we talk, bishops are anxious about filling their communities, as they should be, but in a lot of areas of the world, that need, that luxury doesn't even exist for most communities. So be good to your priests. So there was that. There was a few other little things, but for the most, and being away from family was hard,
Mhm.
even with WhatsApp and FaceTime and all these fun things.
Yeah,
Um,
no, the family wants to see the babies for sure. Yeah, that's absolutely well, but I mean, you
Yaya
think
was
about it,
yeah,
even for the average American priest, right? Like the presbyterat, it's hard because the priest is so busy and is always called away by the parish. But I mean, the kind of work that is going in Guatemala there, that's a lot for your wife to be dealing with when she's trying to raise up 2 little babies as well, and I'm sure she's not sorry to have you around a little bit more, and even as much
sure.
as I don't know if you're even around because it's still a lot, but I guess for you guys, it probably feels not as bad as it does for most new priests.
There's
Is it like
different
you're
challenges in all areas. I mean, it's not like priests aren't busy here in the US by any,
yeah,
clergy are very busy all the time.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
but
but 30
yeah,
baptisms on a Sunday, like, that's, like, something a bishop would handle, right? That's why bishops don't have families is because they need
sure,
to be traveling all the time and doing that,
sure,
but,
sure. And
wow.
most of
Well,
the clergy there are celibate. There's a couple married clergy, and there's nothing against married clergy in the country. It's just
yeah,
for the vicar, it's just easier to move around like that. So,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, because that job really is at this stage in their development, the job of the priest is a little more bishopy, a little less,
sure,
it's a bigger job
mhm,
in a sense, at least with
sure,
travel. But gosh, what a wonderful thing. Thank you so much for coming on and telling us all about
yeah.
Guatemala. And it's nice to get to know you. And it's also really interesting to hear all about everything that OCMC is doing there. If people want to support OCMC, where do they go? What do they do?
So, I mean, ocmc.org. And you can support in multiple ways. I would say first and foremost, OCMC itself to support the actual center because they have staff, they have the directors, they have a missionary director, they have people that are working. You can support the general fund. I highly encourage that because they do wonderful work all over the world: Albania, Kenya, Fiji, Indonesia, Korea, South Korea, Guatemala, Mexico, Colombia. So there's that. And then if you go onto the website, you can also specifically, if you want to support a specific missionary, you can do that. There's different missionaries that you can go. And I highly encourage, if people want, prayerfully think about helping support a missionary on a monthly basis. It was always touching to us to see $20 a month, $15 a month from faithful people was always really helpful and really just beautiful to see that. And the missionaries do notice that and they're very thankful for that. And then if anything, if you want to just ask, hey, I heard about this seminary in Guatemala. Can I set money aside from that? Of course, OCMC allows that kind of stuff. So just go to the website, bother Pres Rene or Father Rob Spaliotis, who's the new missionary director. They would love to take your emails and phone calls, of course.
That's wonderful. So that's ocmc.org, Orthodox Christian Mission Center. And that is, gosh, that's so interesting. Thank you so much, Father Thomas. We really do appreciate you coming on the show and telling us all about this.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. And anytime you want to talk, I'm open. And I do ask if everybody could please keep the mission in your prayers. All of the priests and the clergy and the missionaries. It is a lot of work all the time. And you can follow them on Facebook as well. You can follow them online. But please keep them in your prayers. It's a very difficult life, and they're doing a lot of incredible work all the time.
Well, how do you follow them on Facebook? What is the name of the mission?
So if you want on Facebook, you could look up in Spanish Sacro, Sacro, and then the second word is Arzobispado, Archiepiscopate, Arzobispado de Guatemala, of Guatemala. If you Google search that,
Mhm.
you'll find their page, and you can follow their page. And they're always posting new videos. Just recently, they opened up another new church in the Highlands, and they had a big feast for Pentecost, and they had all these people come and baptisms, and you can watch the whole hour and 20-minute video. They kind of do a lot of streaming. They're very tech savvy, and so you can look online there.
Great.
Yeah. Hmm.
Well, so what I can do is on our Everyday Orthodox Facebook page, I'll link to that Facebook page and then also to the ocmc.org page so that our
Sure.
listeners can find all of it because that sounds wonderful. Well, Father Thomas,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our audience for joining us. And come back next week and we will meet another Everyday Orthodox Christian. Good night.
Good night.
It's really good.